Hey everybody. The purpose of this lecture is to give a brief overview of some health disparities, specifically focusing on the question, why are African Americans so much sicker? The major source for this lecture is a chapter published in 2012 titled Disparities in the Prevalence of Mental Illness Among Black Americans. First up, we'll talk about some of the ways in which African Americans' history has contributed to their current disparities in health. Then we'll talk about some of the within-group variance among African Americans and some of the within-group variance in African Americans' rates of mental illness. After that, we'll talk about some of the between-group variance that impacts African Americans' rates of mental illness. And finally, we'll discuss some of the implications of these disparities and causal elements of these disparities on the social mobility of African Americans. Before we get into our conversation, it's really important to discuss what we mean by race. It is a politically and socially charged term, and in many different areas of study, there are nuances in what is meant by the term race. But here, we'll focus on two different conceptualizations. One conceptualization of race is that of a biological reality, right? So here we're talking about, as it has been described in the anthropological and historical literatures, as, let's say, Blacks versus whites versus Asians, if you will. So Caucasoid, Africanoid, those are some of the terms you may have seen used to reference, if you will, these biological classifications of races. And according to anthropologists, geneticists, biologists, and so forth, race is not a biological reality. The different, if you will, racial groups, if that's what you'd like to call them, are not discrete, genetically speaking. There's an incredible amount of overlap when you're talking about the genetics of the different groups. Also, the different races are not reliably measured physiologically and genetically speaking because there's so much overlap among the different groups. And the small differences that you do find, in addition to not being able to be reliably measured consistently, they're not scientifically meaningful. For example, on average, you might find a very different curl pattern among, say, Blacks or people of African descent compared to, say, Asians or people of Asian descent. But that's not scientifically meaningful. It doesn't relate or impact, if you will, emotional experience or expression. It doesn't impact intelligence. It doesn't impact heartbeats and heart rates and skin sensitivity, etc. So there is no substantive support for the biological reality, if you will, of the conceptualization of different races among people. Now let's turn our attention to the social reality conceptualization of race. Overwhelmingly, anthropologists, historians, psychologists, sociologists overwhelmingly support the notion that there is a social reality to this concept called race. So race, unfortunately, begets racism and race-related stress. And we know that those things are real. They are reliably measured. They are substantive. They are meaningful, and they have significant impacts on people who are who are impacted by the race-related stress. So for example, the targets of the race-related stress or the targets of the racism. We know that the people who target are also impacted, but overwhelmingly we focus on the targets of those constructs. So things like economic deprivation, definitely there's a social reality to economic deprivation of races. Certainly, certain races on average have higher socioeconomic statuses compared to others. Certainly, some races are subjected, I was going to say exposed, but subjected to residential segregation, to violent crime victimization. Certain races have higher rates of incarceration, higher rates of homelessness, higher rates of unhealthy housing. Unfortunately, poor treatment in the healthcare system. So certain groups, certain racial groups are on average taken less seriously when they present with certain symptoms. They receive poor quality treatment. They don't have as good an access to health care or to insurance, which then allows you greater access to health care. So yes, there is a social reality when you're talking about race. It does impact us socially speaking. So while it may not be a genetic reality, it's real. It is a very real thing, and it's unfortunately emboldened and bolstered by the disparities we've established in our community, but that is our reality. So before I move on to the next slide, there's another point I wanted to make before we really get into the key questions of today's presentation. There is a distinction between race and also ethnicity. So a few minutes ago, I was alluding to the notion that depending upon the area of study, you may have different formal definitions of race. It is also the case that depending upon the area of study, you probably have different formal definitions of this notion of ethnicity. Some groups and people use those terms interchangeably. They are not. When we talk about race, we're talking about, for example, Black versus white, or Caucasoid versus Africanoid, if you will, or period. When you're talking about ethnicity, here you're talking about, say, the confluence of race as well as culture. So, for example, with regard to race, you can certainly imagine, because it's true, you have people in the Black race all over the globe, right? So there's Blacks living in South Africa, Ghana, Egypt, Russia, France, Great Britain, the Bahamas, St. Kitts, St. Bart's, Colombia, Cincinnati, Ohio, Canada, etc. All of those people do fall under the heading of Black. But when you bring into that the notion of culture, all of those people's cultures may be very different. So you can imagine the culture of South Africa being very different from the culture of Russia. You can imagine those two cultures being very different from the culture of St. Kitts or St. Bart or Cincinnati, Ohio, or Canada. So when we're talking about race, you usually see labels like Black. When we're talking about ethnicity here, particularly, we're talking about African Americans. Okay, let's move on. Now, when we're talking about African Americans, who are we talking about? Naturally, there are probably thousands of points of light that could be shed when you're talking about defining a group as diverse as African Americans. But in a snapshot, here we're talking about people who do hail from the continent. There are Kemetic origins thousands of years before the Common Era. There were well-established dynasties and groups of people living in very organized, hierarchically structured communities that involved educating children, taking care of elders, systems of higher learning, formal systems, of science and math and engineering. So thousands of years ago, this group's ancestors were already studying and writing and very prolific and very successful, if you will, living a very ordered life, if you will. And so fast forward thousands of years, through the transatlantic slave trade, this group was forcibly brought to the Americas, to the islands and to South America, and then eventually through a breaking process on up to North America, which is where they settled. They were subjected to American chattel slavery, which was a very brutal form of slavery. And present day, there are approximately 14 million African Americans. About a little over 13% of the US population classifies themselves in this group. It is the third largest ethnic group in the United States, and the culture is very collectivistic as compared to the more individualistic culture of America broadly defined, and also of some of the other, for example, the largest ethnic group in the United States. There are unique markers to this culture and to this ethnic group. For example, while English is the primary language, Ebonics is also very often and frequently spoken and artfully crafted among this group. And if you want to learn more about Ebonics, you can read up on the work of Dr. Robert Williams. There are other symbols and practices. For example, the jumping of a broom during a wedding ceremony has been practiced among African Americans for hundreds of years. Even after the enslavement was legally ended, you still see African Americans, even to this day, jumping a broom. And so if you want to learn more about that practice and its significance to the group, definitely look it up. It's a wonderfully rich story. Also, other things like Black History Month and the practice of Kwanzaa. And if you would like to know more about some of the specific defining central markers of this ethnic group's culture and the ways in which they view the world and the ways in which the world views them, please take a look at Wade Boykin's work. He has explored 9 central elements or central tenets of this group, and I have listed them there. But for the sake of time, I'm trying to keep this a little bit shorter. So I'm going to move on to our next key question, which is, in what ways did African Americans' history contribute to their current disparities in health? So as we just mentioned, through the transatlantic slave trade, this group was forcibly brought to the Americas. And from the 1500s to the 1800s, the overwhelming majority of Blacks in North America, but certainly in the United States, were enslaved. And it was a very brutal, sadistic form of enslavement. It was unnatural, it was malevolent, it was punitive, it was barbaric, and it took a toll. The unnatural, malevolent experiences and selection that occurred during this American form of chattel slavery, it produced higher rates of physical as well as mental illness in this group. Psychologists like Toussaint and Parham and others, Kobe Cambone and others, speculate that the rates of post-traumatic stress disorder and other illnesses like depression, generalized anxiety disorder, inferiority complex, suicidality, homicidality, those were astronomical, and it is impossible to do a good job, or if you will, a precise job of trying to estimate those rates of illness and try to think about the ways in which those astronomically high rates affected their progeny and continue to affect their progeny. But you do have researchers who have written extensively on that and who have tried to certainly comment, if you will, on things like, for example, post-traumatic slave disorders. So you have Joy Degree Leary, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, and also Naim Akbar, Kobe Cambone. Many African American psychologists have written extensively about that work. And so if you'd like to learn more, I encourage you to look up their work. So African Americans present day are the progeny of this group. So you can imagine if, to use some of the euphemisms, if Big Mama, beat all your grandmother and her sisters and brothers, and then your grandmother had a tendency to beat your dad or your mom and all of their sisters and brothers, what do you think the likelihood is that your mom or dad is going to be willing to beat you or taken, which is a form of self-harm, right? It's extreme violence when you really think about what it is. And Joy DeBry-Leary, she's written extensively on that. I also encourage you, if you look up that, you should look up the work of Stacey Patton, who's written a wonderful book called Spare the Rod, as it relates to the physical punishment of the unique form of physical punishment that African American children suffer in this country and what it does to them psychologically as well as socially. But I said all that to say there are many, many ways in which the ancestors and their experience has been handed down either genetically or socially and behaviorally to subsequent generations, such that we, present day, may do things that are not necessarily healthy for ourselves or for each other, but the history has certainly contributed to that ill health. Period. So, next question. Can we describe some of the within group variance in Black Americans' rates of mental illness? Well, yes, we can. The literature is not, I will say, wholly consistent. There are some studies that find substantive, statistically significant differences, and others have null results. But you can still look through the chapter, and there's a wealth of references that you can certainly use to read more about these different points. But just in briefly, while it is the case that the enslavement of African Americans ended in excess of 150 years ago, at that time, the group was far more homogeneous. Present day, this group is very heterogeneous, right? So while there are 40 million, for example, while there are 40 million African Americans, approximately, gosh, and while overwhelmingly African Americans are poorer and do have lower levels of socioeconomic status, that's not to say that there aren't some billionaires and millionaires within that group. So that's a lot of variance there. We have in terms of education, there's a lot of variance there. In terms of political and social influence, there's a lot of variance there. So there's a lot of diversity within the group present day in terms of where geographically they live and from a socioeconomic status, where they live, et cetera. So there's a lot of diversity. There's a lot of what we call now a celebration and an appreciation for the intersectionality within the group. And so just as an example, the group is not monolithic in all of those other lifestyle markers, income, influence, job status, etc. The group is not monolithic in those, so it stands to reason that the group would not be monolithic in its rates of physical illness or mental illness. So for an example, in terms of depression rates among African Americans, we do see African Americans of higher socioeconomic status levels actually tend to have higher levels of depression. And that is counterintuitive. So yes, you heard that right. Wealthier African Americans tend to have higher levels of depression compared to poorer African Americans. I know you can read more about that, the diminished returns hypothesis in the chapter, or of course in the broader literature, but it is a fascinating concept, I will say that. But also among African Americans, women tend to report higher rates of depression. Single people tend to report more lifetime or higher lifetime rates of depression. And Blacks who live in the North, as compared to Blacks who live in the South, tend to report higher rates of depression. And so this is just to highlight this notion that the group is not monolithic. It is very diverse. And because of those things, you do see within group variance as it relates to rates of mental illness. Next question, what about the between group variance? So not just looking at comparing Blacks to Blacks, but comparing whites to Blacks, or Jews to Blacks, or Native Americans to Blacks, or Asians to Blacks. What are some of those between group variances? And subsequently, or relatedly, how might those between group variances impact Black Americans or African Americans' rates of mental illness? And you'll notice that the term is switching here because of how the broader literature has studied it, right? So if I'm talking about, say, some of the other researchers who have looked at Blacks versus whites as opposed to African Americans versus Africans in America versus others, I have to use the terms that they use so that I can report their findings most accurately. So you'll see that the phrases African Americans and Black Americans changing on some of these slides and on some of these lines. So now we're turning our attention to some of the between group variances. So if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Census Bureau, it is the case that Black Americans are poorer and sicker, right? So we have higher rates of unemployment, we have higher rates of underemployment, we have higher rates of a lot of the physical illnesses, chronic illness and disease like diabetes, strokes, high blood pressure, hypertension, heart disease. We do have higher arthritis. We have higher rates of those. And you would imagine when you think about all of that, plus the fact that we suffer from so much race-related discrimination and race-related stress and microaggressions and et cetera on a daily basis, you would expect for the rates of mental illness to be astronomically higher present day, but you actually don't see that. And so there's a lot of pieces that have been written about perhaps why that is, in terms of perhaps resilience or spirituality or just the collective orientation and disposition of the community, such that it tends to pull together and band together and help and support one another. And so that I will leave you to speculate on why you don't see as high rates of mental illness as you do, for example, the physical illness. But just know it's not a one-to-one isomorphic guarantee there. That said, you do see some disparities that are fairly consistent and fairly consistently able to be measured and evident in the data sets. So it is the case that some of these differences can be explained by differences in socioeconomic status. For example, if you have more money, you're going to have better access to health care. You're going to have better access to health insurance. You're probably going to have better access to a cleaner living environment, less stress overall, right? And so those types of things, because all of those are directly related to physical and mental health, if you have money and those things are thereby taken care of for you, that's going to automatically bring down your likelihood for developing, mental illness, or the having to deal with a longer duration of mental illness in some instances. So yes, it is the case that socioeconomic status can attenuate some of the race differences, but it doesn't wholly account for them, right? So, for example, even if you're an African American making $6 million a year, you're still on average going to have higher rates of physical illness as well as higher rates of mental illness compared to, say, a white person who makes that much money, or even a white person who makes less than that. Right? So this is consistent with the notion that yes, socioeconomic status is important. Yes, if you are richer and Black, that will afford you some luxuries and some better health, but it's not going to fix it all, right? So the disparities are still there. And again, you can read about some researchers' posits on why that is and what the true links are and how to best explain those. But remember, this is just giving you a snapshot. So while controlling for socioeconomic status does attenuate some of the race differences, it does not wholly account for all of those differences. And some of the examples where you see consistent differences among races, such that you see higher rates of these illnesses in African Americans, are in these following areas: isolated sleep paralysis, post-traumatic stress disorder, that was particularly among Vietnam veterans. That study focused on Black males. Bipolar disorder, that study was focusing more so on women, but you do see high rates. Obsessive compulsive disorder, a specific marker of that. Depression, and the duration of the depression. And perhaps the rates overall are higher, but in this study, it was consistently found that the duration of the depression was statistically significantly longer for Black Americans compared to whites. Schizophrenia, Blacks are statistically speaking more likely to develop schizophrenia. And also, which is closer, this is not a mental illness, but it is closely associated with help and the alleviation of suffering, and that's access to adequate health care. Blacks have poorer and less access to adequate health care. And again, it can be partially attenuated by socioeconomic status, but we also know that there have been some very famous cases recently, like with Serena Williams and the birth of her daughter, and some other famous Black Americans who they are as rich gets, but they report not being taken seriously by their medical health professionals. And in some instances, it had some life-threatening effects, right? So in those areas listed there on the slide, you do see consistently higher rates of illness and poorer prognoses for African Americans, regardless of socioeconomic status. Okay, so now that we have talked about a number of things, let's turn our attention to the brighter side. Things are not as healthy as we would like them to be. Things are not as healthy as they deserve to be, and as African Americans deserve them to be, or as healthy as they could be and are in other areas for other groups. And so we want equity, right? That's the goal, not equality, but equity. And so, how can things be made better for this group? What are some of the implications for upward social mobility? Given what we now know, how can we use that information to improve policies? Now, again, it's complex. It's not always a one-to-one, easily described, easily defined, easily fixed thing, right? So these systems of oppression have been in existence for hundreds of years. And of course, you can't just write a neat and tidy policy that's going to fix it all with a stroke of a pen. But there are some recommendations. And so, one, providing health literacy education for not just Blacks, but everyone, but definitely for Blacks, so they can understand perhaps some things that are viewed as cultural may not be cultural. Maybe it's reflective of a building or budding problem that could more easily be addressed if it is captured and treated earlier on. You know, also in terms of healthcare or health literacy, that could possibly alleviate some of the anxiety that a lot of African Americans have when it comes to the healthcare system, right? So we have a beleaguered history. I mean, just look at the Tuskegee syphilis study is just one of hundreds of studies that were very similar in their impact on the quote participants. You could also call them victims. It just depends on your perspective. So because we are aware of that, and many of us have friends and family members who've gone through these types of things, there is a healthy and appropriate anxiety and reluctance to engage with the healthcare community. So health literacy education is going to be very helpful in terms of alleviating that and making African Americans less likely to seek help and to seek it when it perhaps could do the most good. Also, improving access to adequate health care. So this Affordable Care Act is, politics aside, it's critically important. It's meant the difference between life and death for a lot of people. And especially people who could not afford healthcare or who don't have access to full-time jobs that would bring with them benefits of healthcare offerings. Right? So access to adequate healthcare is critically important. It means the difference between life and death for thousands of people. And when you're chronically poor, you're more likely to be homeless, you're more likely to be unemployed and underemployed, you're more likely to experience economic deprivation in other ways, poorer levels of education, higher rates of morbidity, and higher rates of mortality. Healthcare is really going to mean the difference between you continuing to live or dying an early death. So that is something that is strongly recommended. Um, the National Medical Association and Williams and, gosh, the American Medical Association too has these recommendations if you want to read more and in more depth. Requiring ethnic sensitivity training for healthcare professionals, that is critically important. I remember once one of my adopted grandmothers, she had a touch of the sugar, is how she used to call it. She had diabetes, but she called it a touch of sugar. And I remember she would have to test her blood sugar levels in the mornings when she got up. And so I could not say, Grandma, what's your blood sugar level reading for the morning? Because she would look at me like I was trying to get smart and, uppity. And so I would just ask her something like, well, Grandma, what did the script of paper say? Now, to her, the script of paper was a little tiny, if you prick your finger, for those of you who may be diabetic or who've seen this, um, traditionally, they would have to prick their finger and then have a little testing strip, a little piece of paper that they would dab the blood onto. And then they would insert that into a testing machine that would test the level of whatever it is in the blood that would give the person then the indication of how much insulin perhaps they needed to take. And so I couldn't ask her, what was your blood sugar level reading, Grandma? Because again, that wasn't the phrase that she used. She wasn't really sure what I meant. And she would take it as an affront, like I was trying to use big words to get over on her or to speak over her. So I would have to say, well, Grandma, what did the script of paper say? And then she would be like, oh, baby, it said 96 or something like that. So I said all that to say ethnic sensitivity training is more than just let me learn about the history of that group in this country. It's let me learn about the language of this group. Let me learn about the feelings and the support systems and approaches to healthcare in this group so that I can provide the best possible care in a way that it will be received and in a way that it'll do the most good. So definitely requiring ethnic sensitivity training for healthcare professionals, that is going to be key. And also providing treatment paradigms for this group that are culturally specific to Black Americans. We cannot stress this enough, like the work of Thomas Parham and Adisa Jamu and White and Hilliard and Cambone and so many people would suggest that it is not the case that mental health care is a one-size-fits-all situation, just like physical health care is not a one-size-fits-all situation. You've got to nuance it in a way that allows it to serve the population in front of it to its best possible ability. And that means sometimes you have to make your treatments and your assessment paradigms culturally specific so that they can be as sensitive as possible to do the best good. So if those recommendations are taken into account and implemented, we can achieve our best lives, and we will have the access that we need to the greatest level of health. And then with good health, we can be more prosperous and more productive and more prolific. But with poor health, all of those things are incredibly fragile and far less likely. So uh, there's a lot of work to be done, and there's plenty of it to go around. And so I just encourage us all to keep that in mind as we go and move and live and breathe, so to speak, but also as we think about policy implications and what could be done and what should be done differently moving forward for the greatest possible good. So I will stop here and with the recap slide and encourage you, as is always the case, if you have questions, let me know. You have my email address. If you would like to set up an appointment to talk one-on-one, you have the address to my online scheduler as well. And I look forward to reading your answers to the discussion questions for this week. I also look forward to talking with you during our synchronous meetings and finding out more about what you have to say about these and related topics. Thanks, everybody.